Hello, and welcome to Organizations in Motion, the podcast where we explore the art and science of organizational transformation. I'm your host, Dr. Inga James, social worker, organizational psychologist, and founder of Organizational Renewal Group. Today, we're talking about something that sits at the heart of sustainable organizations, the renewal mindset. In early episodes, we talked about how organizations navigate change and how leaders translate information into strategy. Today, we take that conversation one step deeper because the truth is, organizational renewal isn't something that happens once every 3 to 5 years during a strategic planning process. Renewal is a mindset. It's a way of thinking about learning, adaptation, and leadership that allows organizations to evolve continuously rather than react only when crisis forces them to. Many organizations still operate as if they were machines, predictable, controllable systems where the right plan produces the right outcome. But organizations are not machines. They are living systems made up of people, relationships, and evolving environments. Markets shift, technology changes, communities evolve, and the expectations of employees and stakeholders continue to grow. In that kind of environment, organizations that survive and thrive are not the ones that plan perfectly. They are the ones that learn continuously. Today, we'll explore what it means to build a culture where renewal becomes part of everyday work. We'll talk about the characteristics of learning centered organizations, the practices that support them, and the leadership behaviors that make renewal possible. And later in the episode, I'll be joined by Sarah Ariana of Three Raptor Consulting, who brings deep expertise in using data, visioning, and organizational insight to help organizations navigate change in thoughtful and sustainable ways. The idea that organizations must continually learn and adapt is not new, but it has become increasingly urgent in the last 2 decades. A growing body of research supports the idea that organizations perform best when learning that becomes part of the culture. Peter Senge's work on learning organizations shows that adaptive organizations cultivate shared vision, team learning, and systems thinking so that learning becomes embedded in everyday work. High reliability organizations, or HROs, are those that operate high risk, complex environments where failure could have catastrophic consequences. Studies of high reliability organizations from aviation to healthcare reach a similar conclusion. The most resilient teams continuously examine mistakes, question assumptions, and learn quickly from experience. More recent research on knowledge sharing and organizational learning also shows that organizations that actively promote reflection, collaboration, and collective learning experience stronger performance and more resilient teams over time. But why? Because people share information earlier, they raise concerns sooner, and they experiment more often. Another area of research that supports this idea comes from neuroscience. Our brains are designed to protect us from uncertainty. When people experience rapid change or unclear expectations, the brain's threat system activates. This can lead to defensiveness, resistance, and reduced cognitive flexibility. But when individuals experience trust, autonomy, and shared purpose, a different neural response occurs. The brain becomes more open to learning, creativity, and collaboration. So the culture leaders create literally shapes how people think and behave. We also see evidence of the renewal mindset in organizations that have successfully navigated major disruption. Companies like Microsoft are often cited as examples. When Satya Nadella became CEO in 2014, he shifted the company culture from what he called a know-it-all culture to a learn-it-all culture. The emphasis moved toward curiosity, experimentation, and cross-team learning. The result was not only cultural transformation, but significant financial and strategic growth. Across sectors, nonprofit, government, and for-profit, the pattern is remarkably consistent. Organizations that foster learning, reflection, and psychological safety adapt faster with less internal friction. Now I'd like to welcome our guest today. I'm delighted to welcome Sarah Oriana back to our podcast. She's a nonprofit strategist, grant writer, and the founder of Three Raptor Consulting. With more than 18 years of experience, Sarah has helped organizations secure over $25 million in funding by combining data-driven program design with powerful storytelling. She also hosts The Route to Success, a podcast that explores leadership, resilience, and the real journeys behind building meaningful work. Through her consulting, writing, and mentoring, Sarah helps nonprofit leaders and entrepreneurs transform big ideas into sustainable, mission-driven impact. Sarah, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
Me too. Let's dive in.
Okay.
One theme we're discussing today is the idea of a renewal mindset. In your experience, what does it look like when an organization truly becomes curious about learning rather than defensive about information?
That's a great question. I think when organizations are truly open to learning, the energy that they give off is one of curiosity, and they're open to new ideas. They're also, I think what's key to this is that within the organization, there's a culture where it isn't failure, it's growth. So they're very open to experimenting. They're very open to doing shorter pilot programs or pulling data out in shorter, smaller pieces so that they can pivot and adapt as needed. So it's more, I would say, you see programming and the workplace function more as a wave versus a straight line because they're not locked in. They understand the importance of feedback and they're confident enough in the work that they do to go ahead and get that feedback and make those changes. And I know I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again. This mindset shift happens at the top. It happens with a leader. And so you have to have a leader who is not afraid to be vulnerable and is always talking about learning and making it maybe like a standing line item on the weekly meeting or monthly meeting to just ask an open-ended question like, what's something you learned this month that really excited you? And just keep that conversation going, even in areas other than specific to work.
You know, one of the things that I think is most difficult to deal with when there's not a learning mindset is the cognitive inflexibility that we talked about earlier. That people just close their minds because they don't want to hear what they don't want to hear.
That's so true. And this is going to make you laugh, but the best analogy is if you have pets, when your pets choose to turn off their hearing. That's what I say with my dogs. You can actually see them physically close their ears on a don't have to listen. And they get a very stubborn look to their face. Nobody wants to be that way, right? So you have to always be open to listening and hearing.
And again, like you say, it comes from the top. People have to create that culture. Kind of a segue into the next question. Many leaders worry that transparency about challenges or performance data could create anxiety or resistance. How can leaders share information in ways that actually build trust rather than fear?
I think this is a topic I'm going to have to be very careful not to get on a soapbox about. So when information is not shared openly, that's when fear is created. If staff sees or perceives, I think we need to use the word perception here, not what they see, because it's so important what people perceive and what they hear and then how they translate things. And let me just, if I could take one step back before I answer this, remember that the way that people see and hear things is filtered through all of their lenses. And we don't have a way of knowing what those lenses are. So it's their trauma, their past, their unmet needs, their met needs, everything for that day and for that moment, right? So they're perceiving and interpreting what's going on. So if they see that they have a lighter week or they notice that it seems like the office has been quieter quieter for a while, rather than knowing that, oh, hey, we're in a little bit of a slow season. So here's our plan. They're going to start to perceive that business is dropping, and they're going to start to ask questions. Why is business going down? And so it's going to unintentionally create this toxicity and this worry. Where if you have regular check ins, and I have a very small team, but we check in weekly, sometimes daily, depending on what's going on. And I am very, very open. I'm like, we have this many spots open for new clients, or hey, we're maxed out, or hey, we just got done spending a lot of money doing some upgrades. Let's try not to spend money for the next few weeks just so we can catch up and level out. And I think it's in how you say it, where you say it. I tend to say things very casually, like that, where it's more conversation tone. Or I will try to have a plan and I'll try to think of how to frame it. And that's what leaders need to think. So if you are entering your slow season, what I always would say is, hey, we're entering our slow season. If you want to take vacation, this is a great time. Or we're going to start rotating Fridays off because we're in a slower season as a reward for when it's higher. Or we're going to start cleaning, but we expect to have it back up to speed by this point. You can see these trends in this past data. It's all in how you create that presentation so it can be brought in.
Yeah, very interesting. It's all in the message. Transparency is really critical for building trust in
Mhm.
organizations, but there's a real fine line between what you should and what you shouldn't share.
True.
When you think about, I'll give a real common example, and that's payroll. Some organizations share that with everybody on the team. Many organizations, most I'd say, don't. However, that's always a curiosity among staff. So, understanding how to translate information like financial information
Mhm.
to the teams then has to be done very carefully. But there are ways that you can get around that kind of delicate stuff.
And, maybe one of the key things is to sit down with senior leadership and even include middle leadership and say, what are pieces of information that are important to you and your team to share? And work it from that angle too.
That's great. Bringing the team in and shouldering part of that decision is great.
Mhm.
So, Sarah, you work closely with leadership teams during visioning processes. What have you seen leaders do that either helps or unintentionally undermines the development of a learning centered culture?
I think when you are talking about these visionary sessions, when you're talking about strategic planning, it's very key who you have at the table and the planning and the structure and the setup of that event. And so I would say for me, if I'm facilitating that, when I facilitate that, I spend almost as much time on that planning and who's included versus the actual session and the reporting. And so often I'll say to leaders, it shouldn't just be you and the board. You should have people that are on the front lines there. You should have people that are middle management, program leads. And it should be the people who are going to honestly give you back that feedback because some people just might not be a good fit or it might not be their thing. But what's important is that you identify who are the right people to have at the table. Make sure that you have a fair representation of every level of the company. And then I think it's really important to set your boundaries and parameters. And so starting off with saying, we're not going to talk over each other. We're going to respect every idea. If an idea doesn't fit into what we're going to talk about, we're going to put it over here to address it. And I know that that sounds all very basic, but I think that is what sets that up for that success. And then if they want to have a renewal mindset, if they want to make learning a priority, then that needs to be a goal. And that goal needs to be assigned to somebody, and there needs to be a way to track it, right? And because we all know if it's not written as a goal and if it's not assigned to somebody, it's not going to get done. It's going to stay on your to do list forever. And so maybe it's giving everybody a budget and you measuring the usage of that budget to attend a certain number of webinars and trainings, right? Or maybe it's every month you have somebody present a webinar, but it's something that has to be included with a goal and how you're actually going to present this and share this. And when you walk it all the way through to the end and when it's important to everybody, I think that's what's going to make it part of that visionary process and what's going to get the conversation going and where everything's going to work forward.
That's wonderful. Not all leaders, as I'm sure you know, want necessarily a learning centered culture. They just
Right.
but they're interested in status quo. It's always worked this way, and that makes it quite difficult for creating organizational renewal because you can't institutionalize anything. So, if you could give leaders one piece of advice, or two, or three, about building organizations that learn and adapt over time, what would it be?
All right, this is an oldie but a goodie, and I'm going to go somewhere with this. So, I am a huge proponent of the Clifton Strength Builders assessment. I'm not one for personality because personality shifts on where you are in your life and met needs, but your strength is going to really stay. And so, I think when you have an organization who everybody knows their strengths and where you can share the information that they provide on how to communicate to each strength, and it's very clear and very easy to identify the strengths that you're missing so you can either intentionally hire for those missing strengths or you can assign other people to maybe compensate for those strengths. So I think it's knowing the areas that you're missing. And when you intentionally create ways to bring in what you're missing, then that's where you create. And I always like to say, get you a round table. Everybody sits at the same level. Nobody's at the head, nobody's at the end. It's a round table. Maybe do assigned seating so everybody has to sit by somebody different every time, right? Or however it works, and give everybody time to talk and present. And the biggest thing that I always say is check your ego at the door. And I'm a very, very visual person. And I think posters and inspirational sayings really have a time and place. I know interior decorators cringe when you say that, but if you have your staff meeting room and you have a round table and you have a sign by the door that says check your ego at the door, and it prompts everybody to remember, hey, I need to take a minute. Maybe you even create a little area where they can go over and just take a breath, get a glass of water, get a snack, then go sit down, and then always have an agenda. Always rotate the responsibility of who's taking minutes because we both know you can't take minutes and participate in a meeting. So rotate that or have somebody there just to take minutes and have somebody to facilitate and time keep and to keep the conversation flowing. And I think when the leader really represents that, and when the leader isn't afraid to say, hey, that's my weak spot, Inga, I know that's your strong point. Would you mind presenting, or taking ownership of this? Or what do you think it should be? So I think it's when the owner is willing to say, that's not what I'm strong at. That's what you're strong at. Let's do that. And then to make assignments, make check-in dates. And that's what keeps that renewal moving forward. And maybe it's even as simple as the leader sending out a message every Monday. Hey, I hope you all had a great Monday or a great weekend. Here's an inspirational thought for the day. And I would love to know what you're learning this week. It's really simple. It's an easy way to get those conversations started and keep the vision and learning tied together.
What I always tell leaders, as well as those that are up and coming and will be our next generation of leaders, is surround yourself with people smarter than you who have
Yes.
talents you don't have so that every one of your, I won't call them weaknesses, but personal challenges is met. So I think that's really important information. It's hard for some people.
I think it's all about being vulnerable. And when you create a safe environment where you can be vulnerable and fail safely, then that's where that renewal and that growth mindset and that continuous learning always happens.
Organizations often move very quickly from identifying problems to trying to fix them. In your experience, what role does reflection and learning time play in helping organizations make better decisions during periods of change?
I think it's really hard to put a very, very specific timeline because time can be very fluid in how these work. I think it's really important to have processes. And I like to classify things as phases versus than saying this is going to take 2 days, this is going to take 3 days. So I think phase one is, do we all agree this is the problem? And do we all agree that this is the solution? And then I think phase two is saying, let's try this solution and see how it goes for 6 weeks, 90 days, whatever you know to be a historically accurate amount of time for you to get enough data. Then take a week or two to review that data. Pivot is needed. But I think when you set those things as phases, that allows you to have that fluidity that is needed to get the accurate data and responses to move forward into that change. And I don't think it's a bad thing if you have a committee that's comprised of analyzing the data who maybe monthly gives a report out on things they've noticed. That way, you're not just doing new projects or old problems. You're constantly monitoring data. I like to kind of keep a pulse and a feel on what's going on so that we can pivot in every area. And so it's really about that. And there's always people who love data who are going to willingly do that.
Absolutely. That's a great idea. I'm stealing it, Sarah.
You can have it.
You work at the intersection of data, visioning, and strategy. How can leaders balance quantitative data with the lived experiences of staff so that decisions reflect both insight and humanity?
That is such a great question. I think that in order to accurately do that, you need a team who is very self aware and is very emotionally intelligent. And I think you also need to be able to say, hey, this is a little too close to home. I need to tap out on this one and give people permission so that you don't have any negative or toxic emotions brewing, but you also don't unintentionally traumatize any staff because trauma can come in any ways. And I like to just identify that. But once you have that staff that practices self-awareness, that is emotionally intelligent, that knows that they need to tap out from that problem, they can. I think a lot of times then it's really important to understand what story the numbers tell versus what story the lived experience tells, and then see how you can merge the two together. And I think when you turn numbers into stories, that's when the two merge together quite nicely. And I think it's also really important to have a record or knowledge of lived experience and who has what specialties so you can pull the right people onto that team and always make it optional. I think sometimes those extra things need to be optional or feel honorary versus just another task.
I encourage other leaders to practice is to meet with their direct reports on a weekly or biweekly basis, because then you're going to learn about what their
Mhm.
challenges are, what their roadblocks are.
Yes, I agree with you. You have to have those weekly meetings and you have to have the kind of relationship where they can say, this is my challenge.
Right. So, lastly, and this is that same, um, still discussing anxiety around being vulnerable, I guess. Many organizations say they value experimentation, but staff still fear making mistakes. What practical steps can leaders take to create an environment where thoughtful experimentation and learning are actually safe?
Yes. So I agree. It's really hard to, especially when you have come from bad working experiences and bad working environments, to understand that this is a safe place to fail. And so I think the best way to create that environment is to, at monthly meetings, ask for volunteers who will share their stories or have a panel and talk about what they experimented. And then instead of saying how it didn't work, say, here's where I'm stuck. Can you help me as a team? And I think maybe make that part of a cycle in a meeting where you're saying, here's what I've been working on. Here's where I'm stuck. I would love other people's insights and be very careful on the vocabulary that you choose. But when you have these things as standing agenda items, and when you ask for volunteers, hey, Inga, I know you're never afraid to talk at a meeting. Would you mind talking about a recent challenge that you've had? And kind of just frame it with the vocabulary we like to frame it with and ask for help. I think that's when you get it, especially when you're very strategic and always have a member of senior leadership as one of the chosen volunteers. So you see it from all levels, not just lower levels. I think that's
Right.
that balance that you're looking for.
One of the things that I work with organizations on are creating a trauma informed culture.
Mhm.
And with nonprofits, being trauma informed is not foreign anymore. Most human services organizations understand about trauma and are working on becoming trauma informed, but it's a culture change. Within becoming trauma informed, one of the principles is transparency. One of the principles
Mhm.
is empowerment, giving voice to the staff, giving voice to the people who may have experienced trauma. And so I think creating a psychologically safe environment can be difficult, very difficult. Like
Mhm.
you said, you're dealing with people who have past experiences, and that's where the trauma comes in.
I wonder if listening to you, if creating peer mentorships would help with that, where you match somebody between entry level and senior leadership, and they met in at a set interval, but in an informal setting just to talk. I wonder if that would help with easing some of the tension around that.
Well, one of the other principles of trauma informed practices is peer support, making sure that the person does not feel isolated and alone, and bringing in support that will not only provide that extra little bit of confidence to the person, but also a sounding board.
Yes.
It's a safe place. I think that's a great idea.
I think too, teaching your staff to ask this question, do you want me to listen or do you want me to solve?
Yeah.
And teaching them it's always okay to ask for clarification. I mean, I do that with my team, but I also do that with my daughter sometimes because I can't tell what she's asking for. So I'll say,
Mhm.
are you asking me to listen or are you asking me to solve this? Because I'm happy to do either. And by me introducing that question, our relationship has improved. My team's relationship has improved because now there's clarity and it's that understanding that if I feel a little bit lost, it's okay for me to say, I 100% want to be here to support you. Can you tell me what you need from me right now? And I'll give that to you.
Yes. Many of these things that we're talking about really work in your personal life too. So, Sarah, thanks so much for sharing your insights and experiences today. The work you're doing with organizations helps them turn information into meaningful learning, and that's a crucial part of sustainable renewal. As we close today's episode, I want to return to one simple idea. Renewal is not a project, it's a cultural habit. Organizations that thrive over time cultivate environments where people feel safe asking questions, sharing ideas, and reflecting on what they are learning. They build routines that encourage curiosity rather than perfection. And leaders play a critical role in modeling that mindset. When leaders say things like, here's what I'm learning, here's what surprised me, and here's what we might try next, they signal that growth matters more than certainty. They also show some of their own vulnerability for not having all the answers. And that is the beginning of a learning centered culture. Thank you for joining me for this episode in the podcast series of Organizations in Motion. If you found this conversation helpful, I hope you'll share it with a colleague or a leader who's thinking about how to help their organization adapt and grow. As we wrap up today's episode, the central idea is this: renewal is not a moment, it is a habit. When leaders nurture curiosity, create space for learning, and encourage thoughtful experimentation, organizations develop the capacity to evolve over time. And that capacity to learn, adapt, and move forward together is what allows organizations not to just endure change, but to grow through it. Till next time, I'm Dr. Inga James, reminding you that organizations are not static structures. They are living systems, always learning, always evolving, and always in motion. Until next time, take good care. Thank you.